with us tonight on the panel, Labour MP Diane Abbott, a thorn in the flesh of the Tory government and now no friend of New Labour either. The Shadow Home Secretary, Sir Norman Fowler, who's worked for 4 Tory leaders, tramping a long road from Heath to Hague. Rabbi Julia Neuberger, Chief Executive of the King's Fund, an independent health service think tank, such a full-time job that she had to give up 47 voluntary jobs to take it on. Mingis Campbell is the Liberal Democrat spokesman on Defence and Foreign Affairs and sits with Labour on Tony Blair's cabinet committee that's looking at constitutional change. And Brian Sewell is the provocative art critic of the London Evening Standard who condemns much of what passes for contemporary art. So, let's begin with the story that dominated the last few days, of Ron Davies' resignation as Secretary of State for Wales. He made, as you'll remember, his last public appearance on this very programme last week. We've got a question from Catherine Day. Catherine Day?
Right. I believe that Labour are actually cracking down on crime and we're going to spend their time supporting the victims. So why is it that when an MP becomes a victim of crime, they're being cracked down on?
Diane Abbott.
That's a very interesting question. I think that we can rely on the Sunday tabloid press to give us more details about this case. But I have to say, I mean, Ron Davies has now resigned from the cabinet. He's resigned as leader of the party in Wales. And whatever he was doing on Clapham Common so late at night, I think there's a sense in which, actually, for his wife and for his young daughter, this is all very sad. And I don't want to be judgmental about a colleague. I think clearly there is more to come out. But I think what one can say is this has all been resolved quite swiftly. Those of us that remember the last government, remember the likes of David Mellor twisting in the wind for what seemed like months and endless photo calls with their family outside their house, and we've been spared all of that. I'm very sorry for Ron Davies' wife and child, and I just hope that it will die down.
But the question was, why did he have to go? Why did he lose his job?
I know no more about it than anybody else in the audience, but I
Tony Blair or all of us.
I assume that, as I say, that the good people on the News of the World will illuminate us all for us on Sunday.
Brian Sewell, you were shaking your head as Diane spoke.
Oh, I just think this is another kind of Clinton story. I did not have sex with that woman. If the wretched man was prowling about on Clapham Common looking for a Chippendale and ended up with a 50-year-old man with dreadlocks, I think we should all feel very sorry for him. It raises the point, of course, that if this was a homosexual business, we are desperately hypocritical about our attitudes to other people's sexuality. And we should then have great sympathy with the man. If, on the other hand, he was mugged by somebody from whom he was attempting to buy drugs, this seems to me to be an act of such extraordinary hypocrisy from a member of a cabinet that is absolutely so intransigent in its view on drugs that it will not even discuss the matter of decriminalising them. Then he was right to go.
Of course, the government has denied either of those suggestions, that he was involved in either of those things.
To be accurate, what the government has said is that Ron Davies has denied both of those suggestions. Let's be...
That Ron Davies has denied it. All right.
That's the point, yeah.
Norman Fowler.
Well, when I was Conservative Party chairman, as Diane indicates, I did have a certain amount of experience dealing with resigning, not with what you're thinking, with dealing with resigning ministers. And I heard what Diane said, that John Major was always much criticised for taking his time, taking too long, and the rest of it. I do have to say, at least we didn't execute people before we knew what they were actually accused of. And the extraordinary thing is, of course, here, that we don't actually know what he's accused of. I mean, going for a walk on Clapham Common, as far as I know, is not a criminal offence, and nor is actually even striking up a conversation with anyone else. And I think, I mean, in fact, have sympathy, I mean, with Ron Davies to this extent, that I think it's tragedy to see his political career come crumbling down in this way. And I would say that.
Come off it.
Well, they won't come off it. That's what I actually feel. You come off.
Politicians are sitting up there in the House of Commons laying down the moral laws for the rest
No,
of
they're
us.
not laying down the
You're
moral laws.
constantly
What a
laying
load
down
of
moral
rubbish.
laws.
What a load of rubbish. We're not laying down the moral laws for the country. That's exactly what we're not doing.
You keep telling us we have to have, you know, I mean, you keep telling us we have to have proper families and things like that.
Well, of course, you
You'll
have to
never
have.
stop.
You have to have. But we're not laying down the moral laws in the way that you state. And if you, I mean, for me to have personal sympathy with someone whose career has ended in that way, I think, well, frankly, I stand by what I say on that. What I do say about Ron Davies is I think he is just very foolish or very wishful to believe that it's going to end in this particular way.
But when you say we don't know what happened, you're saying we should know if a Secretary of State resigns, what the circumstances are?
I think, to be frank...
Or is it a private matter?
Well, I think, to be frank, that it is unsatisfactory from everyone's point of view, including his own, simply to give a quarter of an explanation. Resigning from the cabinet is a very dramatic thing to do. It's a very serious thing to do. You can't go out and say to the public, well, you know, I'm just going to reveal a little bit of what it was about. I do actually think, from his point of view, he'd be well advised to reveal the real reason why he's done it, because, as Diane indicates, I think if he doesn't, the press will.
OK, man in the second row there. Go on.
Yeah, I just wonder if this begs or comes to the wider question. Do we, as the general members of the public, have the right to know the sexuality of our elected members of Parliament?
Lynn Campbell.
No, is the answer to that, unequivocally. But I think the point about Ron Davies is that by his own judgment, because remember, he reported this to the police and he reported it to number 10 Downing Street, by his own judgment, he found himself in circumstances which were likely to be controversial, and in his capacity as a cabinet minister might have led to him being subject to blackmail or unreasonable pressure. And therefore that's why I have a great deal of sympathy for him, like Norman Fowler, because I think at that stage at least he owned up to the consequences of these extraordinary circumstances.
But do you think, like Norman Fowler, that he should explain what's happened? Do you think, because Norman Fowler left, to spend more time with his family? He gave his explanation.
I wondered when this was going to come up.
Well, it always comes up, and we accepted it at face value.
Thank you. You're not going to challenge it now, are you?
If Ron Davies had asked my advice, then I'd have said to him, go from the cabinet and go from Wales immediately.
But is there an obligation to say?
I think
the
fact that he waited on in that way has undoubtedly subjected him to a far higher degree of pressure than might otherwise have been the case. And I'm very sorry that someone who did so much for his own party and for Wales should find his political career, as it were, blighted in this way.
Okay,
now,
the
question you asked me was whether there ought to be a more full explanation. I think in his own interest there ought to be a more full explanation, because until he gives a more full explanation, he, after all, at the moment, being the only direct source of evidence about what happened, then speculation, some of which we've seen already on this programme, is likely to be rife.
Catherine Day, you asked the question. What do you think?
Well, I don't think he has to explain anything to anybody. I mean, as long as he's not doing something illegal or indulging in, I don't know, child pornography or something. I mean, whether it was a result of, you know, his sexuality, whether that was the issue, or it was to do with drugs, it's none of our business as long as he's doing his job.
So he can quit without saying anything, just quit, just tell the Prime Minister I'm off, and that's enough?
Yeah, I just feel, no, I think the problem is that why he's felt he's got to quit. That's the issue, really, isn't it?
Julia Neuberger.
Yes, I think that's right, because I think if it's about his sexuality, he shouldn't have to quit. It's really nobody's business but his own. And I mean, I actually don't think we have any right to know, although I often think that politicians be well advised to let us know, because at least then you're not subject to all this stuff. But if it's something criminal, then I do think we have a right to know. And I do think there's a complication that comes back to something that was going on earlier, which is about the moral stance that politicians take. And, you know, whether we like it or not, if you have politicians and governments telling us, you know, in a sense, how we should live our private lives, you know, family-friendly policies, or, you know, we're going to clean up the act, all of that stuff, if you have that, then politicians are, whether they like it or not. I mean, I stood for Parliament. I mean, I realise that this is an issue you have to take on, I think, as a politician. You are liable to criticism because you are, in some sense, setting yourself up, telling other people how to live.
Okay. Well, but quite a lot of us go out of our way to avoid doing that.
Yes,
Avoid
but
doing
as a
what?
whole...
Avoid trying to tell other people how they should live their lives.
I mean, sure.
The man in the front row here. Hold on a second.
I think this is worrying. This is all based on media speculation at the moment, particularly the tabloids. And I think we should wait a little while before we decide what is going on, because even the government's press spokesman doesn't even know the facts.
Do you think, though, that anybody has a right to know the facts? I mean, I exclude his family, but in the public arena, does anybody have a right to know?
Yes, I think if he's a public figure, then he ought to be up front.
When he quits?
But, I
Let
mean,
me go, hold on a second, I'll come to you down in a moment. The man in the yellow tie at the back there, yes.
I personally think since the new Labour have come to power in the last 18 months, we've just witnessed whatever Ron Davies has got up to on Clapham Common, which is more to than meets the eye. We've seen the Burnley-Eccleston £1 million affair. There's 2 Labour MPs being prosecuted for tampering with their election, expenses and things like this. There's been a whole catalogue of things. I was just wondering if New Labour now are not more sleazy than old Tory.
Right. Diane Abbott.
I think that's wholly unreasonable. But I wanted to come back to the... I think it is unreasonable. But I wanted actually to come back to what I thought was an important question about, does the public have the right to know MP's sexuality? And I think, no, the public doesn't have a right. But I would like to think that, bit by bit, we're moving towards a situation where people can be open about their sexuality and not be vilified. Because, frankly, I think the public is a lot more open-minded and a lot more sensible about these issues in the tabloid press. And I think it's reassuring that Chris Smith has been able to come out, and it's a 9-day wonder. People's sexuality doesn't matter, it's what they do as politicians that matter.
And do you think do you approve of the attempt to pin sexual orientation, as was done on Newsnight this week, is legitimate when a journalist says, oh, well, so-and-so and so-and-so are well-known homosexuals?
I think do
you approve of that or not?
I think you're being unfair to Matthew Paris. I don't think Matthew Paris was trying to out Peter Mandelson as a homosexual. I think it's a matter of fact that Peter Mandelson is a homosexual, but he doesn't choose to talk about it, doesn't choose to give interviews to Hello magazine about it, but that's his privilege. I don't think it was Matthew Paris' intention to out Peter. I think Peter's sexuality is a matter of fact, but it remains my position. I happen to know it's Matthew Paris' position as well, that people who, for whatever reason, maybe it's their parents, maybe it's their partner, don't wish to reveal their sexuality, ought to have that view respected.
Well, but that's not what happened so far as the Newsnight interview is concerned. Peter Mandelson's quite entitled to have his own sexuality. What happened was on BBC television, watched by millions of people, a particular judgment was made about him. I think that's a breach of his privacy.
No, but it was in the News of the World many years ago. It was in the Standard. I mean, it's...
Sorry, Di, it's a double standard. It's a double standard. You don't say somebody shouldn't share that they're heterosexual. You don't say somebody shouldn't say you're heterosexual. It's taken as read, isn't it? If somebody produces a wife or girlfriend, that's taken as read. You're just saying, don't share that you're homosexual. That's the privacy. It's a double standard.
All right.
It should be a non-issue.
Let me go to the woman. Let me go to the woman in the 5th row there on the left in the brown dress. Yes, you may.
Yes, I'm inclined to agree with Brian Sewell when he says that if there was no implication of homosexuality in the Ron Davies affair, then it probably wouldn't be a matter for resignation, because there are a countless number of MPs who have affairs and get caught, and they have a lot of publicity, and they apologise to their wife and all their kids, and then it just carries on.
So if it had been about sex, you wouldn't think he should have gone?
No, what I'm saying is, if there was no implications of the fact that he was homosexual, he wouldn't have to resign. He'd just have to apologise, get slapped on the hand, and everything would be fine.
Do you agree with that, Norman
Fowler? Well, it's not historically that isn't accurate. In fact, it happens because you've had people who've resigned both for homosexual affairs and for heterosexual affairs.
Eventually.
And actually, I think that it, I mean, I agree with Diane, that it actually doesn't matter whether a member of Parliament, someone in public life is heterosexual or gay or whatever. That doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the actions that he takes, whether those actions actually interfere in his public office. And if they deny his public office, if they negate his public office, then of course he has to resign. Then of course he has to go. I think members of, I don't agree, well, I certainly don't agree that, I think that that members of Parliament are entitled to have private lives, and ministers are entitled to have private lives, but if their private actions begin to impinge and begin to affect and begin to have all kinds of impacts upon their public office, then they must resign.
All right, but so to quote what Ron Davies said in his letter to the Prime Minister, in allowing myself to be placed in the situation with people I'd never met and about whom I knew nothing, I did something very foolish. This is a serious lapse of judgment on my part. Regardless of what he was actually doing, are those words sufficient to warrant resignation?
No.
No, Brian Sewell says.
No.
But it's a question of what he felt
Well,
himself.
yes, we can't really
It's a question of what he felt. We can't go inside the mind of a man who says, I put myself in what I now regard as a very foolish position. I believe it's an error of judgment. I believe it will affect my credibility, therefore I have to resign. There's no way in which any of us can criticise that, because we don't have the capacity to understand the process of thought by which he reached that conclusion.
Being mugged on Clapham Common and having your car stolen and having a knife stuck in your throat, these are not resigning matters. It is not a resignation matter to talk to a perfect stranger who engages you in conversation. The whole thing is a bit odd, but it is not a resignation matter. The thing is, of course, that Ron Davies knows perfectly well that any sort of probing into this is going to lead to a compulsory resignation. He will be chucked out. Better to go quickly and try and save your face than have the whole sordid story. Though why he was trying to buy it on Clapham Common, when I understand you can buy anything you like in the House of Commons.
I think we better move on with just a reminder that we don't know what the circumstances were, despite the fact we've been talking about them.
Or whether you can buy anything in the House of Commons.
I won't ask any of the three MPs here whether you can or can't,
Well,
so I wouldn't expect them to tell us the truth.
No, well, I've never been offered any, I can tell you that.
All right, let's go on to another question. This one about the economy, and of course it affects you very much here in Birmingham with the news about the threat of the Long Bridge closure by BMW. Now, we've got the question from Mike Ayres. Mr. Ayres, yeah.
Does the panel think that the government should come to the aid of Rover to avoid huge job losses, or is this too old Labour?
Should they come to the aid of Rover, Norman Fowler?
Well, I certainly think that they should look at the whole position and see what they can actually do to help. I think what I'm a Birmingham Member of Parliament, so let's declare that interest straight away. And I've had my arguments with my own government on what was then the old Leyland issue. I think the point that needs to be established by and recognised by everyone outside Birmingham is that Rover have made massive strides, massive advances in terms of labour productivity, labour relations. To actually simply write us up as a sort of, the land of Red Robbo, that is a story which is years and years out of date. So massive improvements have taken place here. I think I have to say, Diane, that there was a tremendous amount of resentment. I think that Labour ministers started lecturing people here and lecturing workers here about their productivity. I'm not saying that productivity couldn't be improved. I'm sure it could be improved. But I think a great deal of the problems of Rover have come down to the general economy, have come down to high interest rates, have come down to the strength of the pound, and I think that one can't burke that particular situation.
But what's all this stuff about BMW telling the unions they had to accept changes in working practices within 6 weeks, then? It's the BMW, the management is saying this, not just Peter Mandelson and others.
No, it isn't. I mean, that BMW were saying to Rover, which they, as you rightly say, own, that they wanted improvements in productivity. And I think it's a question of debate whether, in fact, wielding the big stick as they did and saying if we don't get them, the whole thing closes down, whether that's the most effective way of doing business, I don't know. But what I do say, and what I do say with some passion, is that Rover has improved massively over the years that I have known the company, massively. And it would be an enormous tragedy if Longbridge was to close, and the government should look at all the opportunities there for aid, if we can find aid in terms of European regional aid, things of that kind. If we can find that, we should go and get it. But what we want is a Longbridge which continues to make cars, and that's something that I personally will fight for.
And you say European money. What about taxpayers' money? What about direct subventions?
Well, I think we've just got to look at all the options.
You wouldn't rule that out?
I'm not ruling anything.
No, what do you think? Ask the question.
Well, obviously, there's tens of thousands of jobs dependent on the plant, so whatever it takes. I mean, the dome's costing 750 million.
Right.
14 billion, is it, on the Eurofighter? So, you know, when push comes to shove, people can find the money, can't they? So whatever it takes. It's just, it was interesting listening to Sir Fowler. You talking the way you were. I'd forgotten that you were once a member of the Thatcher government.
Can I
it's quite astonishing to hear the tone of what you're saying.
Well, can I just
give you contrast that? I mean, we've got Mandelson speaking for New Labour, but sounding like an old Tory. The world is upside down politically.
Well, it's not entirely upside down. There's a bit of consistency in what I say, because I actually, and I wrote it in my book, I offered to resign on the question of Leyland and aid to Leyland back in the 1980s, and we won't go into that now, but I hope that I've been consistent on that issue.
Campbell.
Well, I've two things. First of all, Rover has made enormous strides. Otherwise, BMW wouldn't have been interested in buying Rover in the first place. But second, the international car market is a very, very competitive place. It's a cutthroat place. And the fact that the Japanese economy is going through such difficulties is bound to have a reflection on the international car market because, of course, Japan plays such a prominent part in that. I think, though, one has to be blunt and to say that the days of government simply signing cheques and saying to companies, we will bail you out because there is a social dimension involved in doing so, those days have gone, and I don't think any member of any political party would argue for that.
They sign cheques for other things, don't they? They sign cheques for other things.
Yes, I know.
Money's there.
As it happens, I support the Eurofighter, but I think the dome is something that we could well have done without. So we might have. But the point I want to make is this: the best thing that the government can do for Rover is to have an economy which allows Rover to flourish and to sell its product. And the problem is, we have a pound that is far too highly valued, and that's a direct result, not of the fact that interest rates are being set by an independent group of people through the Bank of England, but because the government has deliberately said we will not use fiscal policy, we will not use taxation as a means of regulating the economy and bringing the pound down. If the government pursued a better economic policy for the whole of the United Kingdom, then Rover would stand a much better chance.
Well, the woman at the back there with spectacles on.
Given that the economy is going into recession, and we've got all the Asian markets going down, we've got the strong pound, we've got high interest rates. I mean, I work as a business journalist, and I get press releases all the time saying, well, we're in trouble here, you know, help us out. And now the latest news comes, like, in the middle of the motor show, when Rover spent thousands of pounds on their stall, the news comes that there's going to be these redundancies. I mean, for one thing, I think manufacturing has to kind of sort its act out and stop spending money in the wrong direction. But the other point is, I mean, if the government start bailing out one company, where's it going to stop? I mean, how far are they going to have to go to put the economy back on its feet?
Diane Abbott, you were on the Treasury Select Committee until you were kicked off it for having...
radical views.
Radical and improper views. What's your opinion about this?
I think what the government can't do, and it's in danger of sounding like it's doing, is standing back and saying we can do nothing in the face of international global forces. I think we need to remember when BMW is trying to force work practices on the workforce at Rover, they're trying to force working practices on the British workforce at Rover in a timescale which they would never dare to do to German workers, because it's quite a different situation there. And we also need to remember, when people talk about the low productivity at Rover, not only has it made tremendous strides in recent years, but one of the things, and the Department of Trade and Industry's own work shows this, one of the reasons for low productivity is relatively low investment. So it's not all down to the workers and the workers' failings. I think there are things the government could do. I think it was a mistake to hand over setting interest rate policy to the Bank of England. The consequences were completely predictable. Interest rates set for the city and not for the heartlands of manufacturing Britain. I think they need to change the framework in which the bank is setting interest rates, so it is forced to look at issues like growth and jobs. It needs to put people on that Monetary Policy Committee that know something about industry. I think there are things the government could do. I don't think people elected a Labour government last May for us to stand back and see thousands of jobs go and talk about we can do nothing in the face of international global capital.
Julie Neuberger.
I rather agree with Diane on this, because I actually do think that it's irresponsible for a government to stand back and say, oh, it's not our fault, it's nothing to do with us. I think there's a limit to what governments can do when you're in an international decline, international recession. But what I do actually, I disagree with you, I think, about the Bank of England setting the interest rates, but I actually do think that we can do something fiscally, as Ming was saying, and I also think that if we entered the European monetary system and actually we didn't have quite such a high pound, we wouldn't be in quite the situation that we're in now. And I do actually think that's very serious, because at the moment we're priced out of the market. It's not only about productivity, it's also price.
Hold on a second, Brad. Just before I come to you, does anyone here think it would be wrong for the government to intervene, to help? Yes, sir.
There's one important distinction between Rover and the other two public enterprises that have been mentioned, Eurofighter and Dome.
Yes.
They are public sector enterprises which the government is obliged to undertake and to finance, whereas BMW and Rover are a private sector finance. So if the times are hard and they're coming and seeking any financial help, I would expect in return as a taxpayer some return on future profits, or at least an undertaking to return whatever X amount of money is being sought.
Right. And you, sir, in the blue shirt there?
I asked a German business contact of mine whether the German people would allow BMW, Mercedes, VW to fall in foreign hands. No, and do you know what he said to me? I don't have to answer that question, because you know that he would not allow it to go out of their German hands, just as we should have never allowed Rolls-Royce, one of the names in industry that everyone knows throughout the world, and it's fallen into foreign hands. How could we do that? How could we not have enough pride to retain Rolls-Royce of all the companies?
Brunsell.
There's been a tendency in the press to crucify the labour force at Longbridge, pointing out that it makes roughly 1 car for every 3 cars made at the Nissan plant in Sunderland. It is an unfair comparison. Longbridge is an old plant and it does its business rather different way. But the point is that production levels at Longbridge could be considerably higher if, and it's a very considerable if, the British public wanted to buy Rovers. You make the point about Mercedes and BMW and VW and the others. The German market supports German cars. Italians buy Italian cars. The French buy French cars. The British buy cars from anywhere.
But it's almost impossible to buy a British car now, because all the bits come from all over Europe. Yeah.
Well, that is the international.
I mean, you try buying an English car, what would you buy?
Well, they've all died. I mean, anything from Armstrong, Siddeley to Austin, it's all gone. But there is an important point here, and it is, in my view, that Rover have killed their own market. Rover are now the waste paper basket for Austin, Morris, and the whole of the old British Leyland BMC caboodle. What they've done is to relabel as Rovers really rotten cars like Metro.
Not true. I drive.
Let me finish.
I drive a very good Rover.
And nobody has really wanted the 800. The 600 has been a failure. And there is no guarantee that the new one is going to be any more successful. Rover's main mistake has been to charge too much for old-fashioned design. And if you want proof of that particular pudding, look at what they now charge for the Mini. The asking price for a basic Mini is £9,300 for a car designed 40 years ago, for which all the design and manufacturing costs have long since been recovered.
Okay, and I should just point out, you are a motoring correspondent as well as an art critic, aren't you? And you know, he knows what he speaks, in case you're surprised by this.
It would be a very interesting question for the audience to ask them how many of them drove Rovers.
Well, I don't know whether it would be 3 or 4.
Oh, yes.
Half a dozen?
Yeah.
The man in the checked tie there.
Thank you. It's not that long ago that the previous administration gave sweetness to British aerospace to save Rover going underground. Rover is one of the biggest manufacturers in the Midlands, helping so many people and helping the economy at large. Now it's important that the government, which was elected 18 months ago, precisely for the same reason, should support this company and keep so many jobs, because it will affect the economy throughout.
Okay, and one more point from the man down here on the left.
I think it's, as already been mentioned, productivity and working practices. Obviously, there's got to be a certain amount of adaptation to the BMW's working practices. Also, it's not a question of how many cars produced, it's a question of how many cars can be sold. I think in recent photographs in the local publication, there was a giant aerial shot of row upon row of cars that had obviously been finished but weren't sold. So there's another issue about where we sell them as well. We're probably not selling them to a bigger market.
A number of other people want to speak. You, sir, just take one brief point.
Well, yes, I think a number of points have been raised, actually. Now, we operate in a global economy which is very competitive. And I think whilst I do not go along with the point that the government should come in and bail out Longbridge, I think what is important to recognize is that the government has failed in this particular instance in passing over the monetary control over to the Bank of England, and they haven't got any fiscal controls now really to control the economy. Absolutely. But what is also important in the Midlands, and we feel that, as I'm from Birmingham, that we tend to concentrate on Longbridge, and when Longbridge screams, I think the whole nation listens. But what about the thousands and thousands of small manufacturing industries in Birmingham and around Birmingham who actually have felt considerable pressure and problems for a long time, and it is in particular due to the very high level of the pound and high interest rates.
Okay.
So
Right.
the government will
All right. Right. We'll go on to another question. Just before we take another question, if you'd like to be in the audience for question time, we're full actually in London next week, but the week after that we're going to be in Glasgow. So if you'd like tickets, this is the number to call. 08, make sure I get it right, 0894114411, or if you're wired up, you can apply via the website. Let's go on to another question. Shamsul Arifin is a chartered accountant. Yes.
Is it not inhumane to deny Prince Charles same human right which most of us take for granted, that is to live with a partner of his own choice?
Prince Charles should be able to live with a partner of his own choice. There's been much in the news, including an appearance in public together today, I think, at a wedding. Brian Sewell, what do you think?
I think it's absurd that nobody has yet come up with the old-fashioned notion for him of the morganatic marriage, which is the perfectly happy private marriage, which Camilla would never become queen, but she would be his domestic consort. The Church of England, of course, objects to that, but I think we should say a fig to the bishops and the Archbishop over that matter.
Do you know about that?
I jolly nearly wore a purple jacket to make myself as near a bishop as a rabbi can possibly manage. But it does seem to me that he should be entitled to live with and marry whom he chooses. And I actually was delighted to gather that he and Camilla Parker Bowles appeared in public today. I have to say, at a synagogue, which gave me particular pleasure. And it seems to me absurd. I mean, there is the Church of England's view on the remarriage of divorced people, and I think that the Church of England is going to have to come to terms with that. I've always felt that that's wrong, and I also, myself, don't think we should have an established church, so I don't think they should concern themselves very much with what, you know, who the monarchy, members of the monarchy choose to marry. So I think he should be able to marry whom he chooses and live with whom he chooses.
And should she become queen? If he becomes king?
I think if he becomes king, she should become queen, unless there's any very strong reason as to why she doesn't want to.
Would that be a problem for you, Norman Fowler?
No, I don't think it would be a problem for me. I think he is entitled and she is entitled. I think they're entitled to marry. I don't think that a broken marriage should be a bar on someone, even Prince Charles, from marrying again. I mean, I personally have had a broken marriage, and many, many other people have had broken marriages, and I think the idea that you aren't able to marry again because of that is absurd, and I don't think that the rule should be entirely suspended simply because he is the heir to the throne. So I would not have any difficulty with it. I just have one side observation. I do think that the whole process would be made very much easier if somehow people would stop briefing in all these books, and then this new book which comes out, the book which I think has criticised Princess Diana. It is not necessary for the people who I assume believe themselves to be friends of Prince Charles to do this. I think most of us want to remember Princess Diana in a particular way, someone who did good. But I think this whole affair, we need to draw the line under it and move on from it. And I think the sooner that's done, the better.
Particularly for the sake of the children.
Indeed.
I feel a major problem, and the reason why a lot of people are against Prince Charles and Camilla coming together is the stigma we have about Camilla Parker Bowles. Especially, we attribute part of the breaking up of the marriage between Prince Charles and Princess Diana to Camilla Parker Bowles. Therefore, if Prince Charles was to become king, could we see Camilla Parker Bowles as being his partner when she had a role in the bad marriage between them both?
Min Campbell?
You've got to remember the historical irony of all this, which is that Prince Charles, if he becomes the king, will become the head of the Church of England. But the reason he becomes the head of the Church of England is because Henry VIII made himself the head of the Church of England so he could marry his third or his fourth or his fifth wife, I can't remember. I'm a Presbyterian. I'm not...
I'm a Jew.
I'm not deeply involved. But you're English and I'm Scottish. There's hardly a family in the country that doesn't have some member or other who's been through the divorce court. It's a matter of regret, but it's one of the realities of modern life. I think that there's no reason, and there certainly should be no constitutional reason, and there is no other good reason in my mind to prevent Prince Charles from marrying Camilla Parker Bowles.
But his point, that people won't accept it because they think she was part of the problem.
Well, but take a straw. I mean, we're getting into that thing which bedeviled divorce law in this country for years and years and years. Blame. I mean, which of us, you know, who will cast the first stone? Who is without blame? I think most people in Britain are sufficiently mature as we approach the year 2000 to take the view that blame really isn't the issue, and that if it makes him happy and makes him a better candidate to be the king, then this is certainly something he should be entitled to do.
Man in the front row.
The significance here is the church. This is what a lot of people are looking at. Morality, religion. These are very important principles of people's lives. If by chance the prince decides to marry this lady, of course, then so let it be. But I, like a lot of other people, cannot see the unity or see that how can I say, union between the two of being head of the church and at the same time performing duties which are not really conducive to good examples.
It's time to disestablish the Church of England.
Diane Abbott.
But you know, sir, the idea that the royal family has to be particularly holy and moral is actually a 20th century idea. In the 17th and 18th century, the royal family was a lot more dodgy and rackety than it is today. And compared to some of the people that have sat on the throne, Camilla is you know, saintly beyond belief. I think what you have to, what I think about, you have to look at them as people. They've been together now a very long time, through all types of ups and downs. And one thing you can say, even if you don't like Camilla or whatever, is they clearly, genuinely love each other. And I would like to think that at the end of the day, the thing can be resolved so that a couple that have been through so much can actually be together. The thing I think is inhumane, to respond to an earlier question, is the constant rehashing in the tabloid press, who are only looking to sell papers of what happened between Charles and Diana and what that must be doing to her two young boys.
Oh,
that
you're
is
so sentimental about these two wretched
boys. I know, but it's because I've got a boy myself.
They're at Eton. They know all about every possible
Well, I've never been to Eton, so I don't know what it's like. I never went to Eton. I don't know anything about Vice, but I do have a six-year-old boy, and I do think it must be awful to have your parents' marriage, when your mother has now died, endlessly rehashed on the front page of the tabloid papers. But you know, this thing about Camilla isn't pure enough to be queen, 17th century political commentators would have laughed at you. I mean, they saw much dodgier people on the throne.
One point here.
Just in response to perpetually damning the tabloid papers, they do sell in millions, and they sell to people such as us who sit in this audience and perhaps the members of the panel. So I don't think we can just blame them. I think we have to also look at ourselves.
Unlike Rovers. which don't seem to sell so well. Yes, and
very good. Brian Sewell started on Rover.
Whatever you say about Camilla Parker Bowles, she certainly has the dignity to be the Queen, because throughout these matters it seems to me she's behaved quite extraordinarily well.
OK, let's move on now. And we go to the report that came out today, Lord Jenkins' report, the Commission on Reforming the Way We Vote and the Way We Elect our MPs. Mark Stevens is a marketing assistant with a question about this. Mark Stevens? Yes.
Basically, my question is, we all know that the system at the moment isn't perfect with first past the post, but anybody that has any knowledge of proportional representation knows that that system isn't perfect either. Would the panel agree that PR would give extremist parties leverage in a potentially close contest?
Extremist parties like the Liberal Democrats. Ian Campbell?
Well, I hope if you haven't done so already, you'll read Roy Jenkins' report. Even if you don't agree with the conclusions. Even if you don't agree with the conclusions, it's a very good read. It's written very elegantly and very lucidly. No, it will not create this kind of situation as happens in Israel, which I think you may have in mind, where there's a national list, and where I think if you appear on the old swingometer at all, you're entitled to some form of representation. What Roy Jenkins has suggested is a system which continues to provide for the link between MPs and their constituencies, which provides for a more representative parliament, which provides a top-up list of people attached to particular regions of the United Kingdom, which will have the overall effect of giving us a much more representative parliament than the one we have at the moment.
But would it bring the National Front in to East London,
no,
say,
well,
as a constituency?
No.
Isn't that's what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yes. But, well, I believe you've read the report, because what Roy Jenkins points out, the practical consequences of his system is that any party within the region from which top-up MPs would be elected would have to achieve something in excess of 10% of the poll. And the prospect, therefore, of the National Front achieving that within London is pretty remote.
Anybody else want to come in on this? Because we've got another question on this same point. Do you want to speak on that particular point about minority parties?
I'm afraid I'm one of these people that would rather watch paint dry than talk about PR. I think ordinary people actually want politicians to talk about real issues like jobs and hospitals and schools.
It is a real
The people that love PR would have you believe it is the answer to all society's ills. Of course, first past the post is imperfect, but it is the least imperfect system that I can see.
Nonsense.
And one of my problems with PR is exactly yours. I live in a highly multicultural mixed constituency. And one of my worries, you talk about 10%, but it worries me that under PR, quite small parties and perhaps extremist parties of whatever wing could actually hold disproportionate sway.
But have you read the report?
Do Diane
I
Abbott,
probably wouldn't understand it. Like most people, I don't.
You would. It's very
Diane
easy
Abbott,
to
just before we leave it, do you believe, it's been constantly said there are 100 Labour MPs who will vote against any change to the system, and you're obviously one of them. Do you believe there are 100? And would it be enough to scupper it, whatever the referendum said?
I think that most Labour MPs believe it's important to have an electoral system that people understand, first of all, and an electoral system which has a clear link between the constituency and the MP. People of Hackney know who their MP is, and I think that's an important link, just as the people of Sutton Coldfield. And I think that not just amongst ordinary Labour MPs, but in the Cabinet, there is very strong resistance to bringing in a system which people don't understand and has many dangers and drawbacks just to please the Liberal Democrats.
No,
That
is rubbish. That is seriously rubbish, because the system that Roy Jenkins is proposing in the report, which I've actually read, I read on the way up here, is not incomprehensible to ordinary people. It attaches members of... No, hang on.
If it's comprehensible, explain it.
It is actually that between 80 and 85% of MPs would be the normal sort of constituency MPs of the sort that we know now, and that 15 to 20%...
We've had enough.
You don't want any of them. OK, but all I'm saying is this is what it says. It's not my view, OK, Brian? So, but no, and that 15 to 20% would be from a list associated probably with the county. So you would have...
Party list?
You would have party list and individuals. You would go either way.
Open list. Open list.
And so?
And what that would do is it would be a fairer representational system. And I don't know whether that is the right way to go, but I do think the present system is unfair.
That's because you're not.
It's nothing to do with
No,
being
it's
liberal.
not only- it isn't only
It is
that.
that many of us have been all our lives disenfranchised. The whole of my voting life, my vote has been utterly worthless because I have lived in constituencies with safe constituency MPs. In most of these constituencies, and I'm sure it's true of Birmingham, you could put up a pig, or you could put up Caligula's horse, or Caligula himself.
No.
And
actually,
he
Brian,
would get in.
You clearly didn't see the result of the last election. Did you see?
No, look, you're an MP, you've had plenty of time.
All sorts of
You've
safe
had your
seats.
You can't stop her with your hands.
You should have seen Michael Portillo's face on election night last year.
Right,
if you think there is such a thing as an absolutely safe seat, what the last election proved is that anybody can go under the system.
No, all the last election proved is that we are all heartily sick of Mrs. Thatcher's successor.
All right, now
heartily sick.
the man in the white shirt
what
there
we
in the second
really
row.
wanted was as an end to the kind of thing that happens in constituencies now and has happened all my life, and that is that a small caucus of local members of a constituency society elect the MP when they select him, because it is a safe seat. We have, most of us could leave the country when there is an election, and the results would be the same.
The man in the white shirt. Hold on, Norman.
Talk about extremist parties. I should point out it was the Germans actually elected Hitler into power. Changing the electoral system is not going to bring extremist parties into power in Britain. But I think, yes, proportional representation's got to be more than just something to please the Liberal Democrats.
Indeed.
It's got to be about ideas. And I think that's why
generality.
it's a
Never
good
mind the
idea.
Liberal.
Because you're not voting now to say, I'm voting against this MP, so I've got to vote for a certain party. You can vote for the party whose policies you believe in. And I think that's the way Parliament should be represented.
Norman Fowler.
Well, look, Brian Sewell is frankly talking nonsense and completely talking... Just let me explain. If you listen...
You treat me as though I'm stupid. I've been an observer. I've been an observer of constituency MPs like you all my life.
You may have been an observer. You haven't observed very much because you never damn well listened to anyone. Now, just pay Diane for a moment. You've talked about Birmingham. You said it doesn't matter in Birmingham what actually happens under the present system. Let me tell you what matters. Of course it matters. You may regard this as really bad news. I am the only Tory MP left in Birmingham. We used to have lots of Conservative MPs. Now, I don't like that system, but my God, it's the first past the post system working. Don't tell me they're all elections don't make any difference. It's total, absolute rubbish.
But the Liberal Democrats in your seat and the Socialists in your seat, or New Labour in your seat, aren't represented because you've been sitting in your constituency with a majority.
Well,
even at the last election of 15,000.
One out of a
marginal
dozen.
seat.
That is perfectly true. But Birmingham has changed. We all know it's changed. Everyone here knows it's changed. But can I just add? Calm down for a moment and answer this question. What is being proposed? As I've also read this report. What is being proposed is that you're going to have over 500 constituency MPs, but the constituencies are going to be made bigger. The boundaries are going to go. I agree with Diane Abbott on this. And then, in addition to that, you're going to have exactly what Brian Sewell doesn't want. He hasn't read. Well, if he has read, he hasn't actually quite taken.
Another thing he hasn't understood. Is that what you're saying?
I was going to say taken this point. He hasn't quite taken this point because then there's going to be a list system of 150 who will be chosen by the party, we think, and will be added to it.
What's wrong with this?
And an open list.
Well, you say an open list. Your party voted for a closed list only this Tuesday.
Don't get into details of open and closed lists. You have a vote for. Hold on a second. Just to clarify, here you are in Sutton Coldfield. You can vote for Norman Fowler if you want him, and you can vote for various other people who don't. And then at the same time, separately, you can vote Conservative, Liberal Democrat, or Labour, and you get one that represents the region. That's the point.
But might I ask Norman a question? In Scotland, in the last election, the Conservative Party got 18% of the vote. In Wales, they got 19% of the vote. There isn't a single Scottish or Welsh Tory MP. Now, that is not democracy. to say to one-fifth of the people of Scotland and a fifth of the people of Wales, your views are not able to be represented in the House of Commons is not democratic.
Man in the front here, what do you think?
So the current system might not be perfect, but what's the point in changing the system to another system that's clearly not perfect as well?
Exactly.
Absolutely. Well, this is a...
I think that is the whole point.
It's not perfect, why change it?
Well, exactly. That is what the Liberals want.
No. If this was simply for the interests of the Liberals, we would have accepted the notion of the alternative vote, which would not involve any topping up, would not involve any proportionality, and would have served us very, very well in the last election. We argue for a proportional system because it seems to us that Parliament ought to be representative of the range of political opinion in the United Kingdom. Without proportional representation, you won't achieve it.
And a brief last point from the man in the third.
Norman Fowler can sit there and wait for Labour to foul up. Diane Abbott she's still scared that she can be thrown out on the social list, the way she was done on the Economic Committee. And the Liberal Democrats are still waiting that the soup bowl probably can be passed around to them. It's just a self-interest.
OK, let's go on, because we're coming towards the end of the programme, so we better take another question, otherwise we won't get there. President Menem of Argentina in London, and a question from Rachel McEverly. Rachel McEverly.
Can we really have a meaningful relationship with Argentina while the Falklands question remains unanswered?
And the claim on the Falklands still exists. Julia Neuberger.
Yes, I think we can. I was quite heartened by the laying of the wreath. I was quite heartened in a way by President Menem saying that he wasn't going to deny his, if you like, right, or Argentina's right to the Falklands, but he thought that it should be dealt with through diplomatic means. I'm very heartened when a nation that we have been at war with, I have to say, a nation I don't think we should have ever been at war with, but a nation that we've been at war with, that we can now have the sort of relationship where he can come to this country, where there can be, I think, very touching embraces between the mother of somebody killed and somebody from Argentina representing Argentina, and we can actually say between us that these things should be sorted out by diplomatic means. That seems to me a grown-up way to go ahead, and I think it's absolutely wonderful.
When you said we shouldn't have been at war, do you mean you were against Britain going to war
in the Falklands?
Over the Falklands?
Absolutely.
Diane Abbott, were you?
Yes, I think we could have achieved the same ends by other means. Having said that, though, I think as far as the Falklands question is concerned, at the end of the day, we have to respect the wishes of the Falkland Islanders. And they wish to remain British, and we have to respect that. But it is possible, and it's being proved that it's possible, to have a constructive relationship with Argentina, despite that unresolved question.
But hang on, if you respect the wishes of the Falkland Islanders, how can you have opposed the war when the Argentinians took the Falklands?
I believe, I mean, I don't want to...
Respect but not defend.
I don't want to go back over the Falkland Islands question, but I think, though, it could have been resolved in other ways. And the Foreign Office could have seen the writing on the wall earlier and could have been... Yes, I think the Foreign Office should have seen the writing on the wall earlier and intervened diplomatically. I think the actual war was unnecessary.
Rachel McEverly, who asked the question, what do you think?
I think I'm too very heartened by the meetings that have happened this week, but I think if we really want to show commitment to the relationship, I know that a lot of Argentinians still feel very strongly about this, and I think we should at least be prepared to discuss it.
Sure.
The Prime Minister should be discussing with Menem, with President Menem, about the future of the Falklands?
Maybe not on this trip, because it's good to take the time to find what we agree on, but I think for future relationship to develop, I think we should be prepared to discuss it.
Norman Fowler, you were in that cabinet at the time.
Was,
we went to war
I mean,
against what is your view?
Well, I was in the cabinet, around the cabinet table when we made the decision to go to war, and I remember that cabinet meeting and the events around it very clearly indeed. I believe it was right to do that. I think that had we not done that, we would have been abandoning the Falklands to a fate that they self-evidently didn't want and had no desire for. And I think we were entirely right, and I think that the courage and skill of the British troops at that time was formidable, quite formidable. Having said that, I think that the time has actually now come for reconciliation. I think that if we can get better relations with Argentina can get better relations with us, that obviously makes sense.
But would you talk sovereignty? I mean, that's what it's about.
I wouldn't talk sovereignty.
So what would you talk if you wouldn't talk sovereignty?
Well, I mean, the position of the Falklands is not exactly the only issue on the agenda between us and Argentina.
Would you lift the arms embargo?
There are trade.
Would you lift the arms embargo?
I think you would talk about that. You can talk about that. But I wouldn't. I don't think that the Falklands. The reason that we went to the Falklands, the reason that we went to war on that, and it was a very serious war, the reason that we did that was because the vast majority, almost everybody in the Falklands, did not want to be under Argentine rule. And as provided, and as long as that remains the case, that should remain our policy, and to that extent, it must be off the agenda.
Brian Sewell, do you think we can have normal relations while the Falklands question remains unanswered? Or unresolved, I suppose?
I think it's perfectly sensible to attempt to have normal relations with the Argentine. It was, of course, impossible with the regime that was in power when the Falkland Islands were invaded, and I think that is something we must not forget. With President Menem, we are dealing with rather a different kettle of fish. But the kettle of fish is something that we have to think about, because the Falklands is plumb in the middle of a very fecund fishing ground, which is of enormous value. It's also very near the Antarctic. There is rumor of oil. And the moment you have the word oil entering into this kind of discussion, you have, you know, cupidity, state cupidity coming into it. We are very unlikely to let the Falklands go unless we are quite sure that there are no fish left there and we're quite sure there's no oil.
The man in the yellow shirt at the back there.
I wanted to ask, why shouldn't we have normal relations with Argentina? We had a normal relationship with Argentina before they invaded the Falklands, even though they claimed them then. We have more than cordial relationship with Spain, even though they would probably rather like Gibraltar back. And finally, perhaps the Argentinians should bear in mind that were it not for the war, they might not have got rid of their junta so quickly.
And the man in the front here.
Norman, you know very well that at the time when this war began, if Maggie Thatcher had listened to her cabinet at earlier stages, the war may never perhaps have happened. And this hinges back to what we're talking about, proportional representation. She was there with a huge majority. Proportional representation will stop that. Blair is there with a huge majority. I'm a member of the Labour Party. But it means that they can be dogmatic. It means that they can be autocratic, and Maggie was a wonderful example of that.
Ming Campbell.
It's worth remembering that all of the ministers, all of the Conservative ministers in the Foreign Office resigned over the invasion because they had so misjudged the position. We withdrew HMS Endurance, and that gave a signal to the Argentinians that we weren't really serious. And I think the gentleman at the back who made the point about getting rid of the junta is absolutely right. If we hadn't gone to the Falklands and expelled General Galtieri, Argentina would still be in control of the Falklands, and General Galtieri or his successors might well still be in power in Argentina itself.
And now, do you think, as Brian Sewell says, we'll hang on to the Falklands come what may, as long as there's a whiff of fish and...
But we've got agreements about both the fishing and the oil. There is already a separate relationship taking place, irrespective of the issue of sovereignty. One last point. If you want to think about reconciliation, just look at the words of Simon Weston, the Welsh Guardsman, who was horribly burned and who's made such an extraordinary recovery and has been a man of such amazing courage. If someone who went through as much as he did could go to the ceremony in St. Paul's Cathedral and believe that reconciliation was an appropriate emotion to feel on that occasion, then surely the rest of us can manage that as well.
Okay. Thank you. Which brings us to the end of tonight's question time. My thanks to the panel and to all of you here in Birmingham. Next week we're going to be in London, and on the panel, Baroness Shirley Williams, Health Secretary Frank Dobson, Shadow Education and Employment Spokesman David Willits, and the Rottweiler of the Daily Express, Peter Hitchens. So I hope you'll join us again next Thursday in London. Till then.